Charlottesville last August to stop the city from removing a Confederate statue. That is when counter-protesters showed up, and by the end of it all, one person was killed and 19 injured when a car plowed into a crowd of demonstrators. Well, today marks 1 year since that violence, and the city is once again under a state of emergency. Police are blocking off streets and mobilizing hundreds of officers this weekend ahead of another white nationalist rally. Well, with that, we are asking the question, what is fueling the rise of the alt-right? And joining us to talk about this is Barbara Perry. She's the author of In the Name of Hate, Understanding Hate Crimes. And with her is Sam Tecle. He's a researcher who studies racial inequality at York University, which is in Toronto. Now, we should also point out, as we have this discussion here on News Network, we're also streaming this live on our Facebook page as well as on the CBC News YouTube channel. And we also want to get you involved in the conversation. We want to hear what you say about this topic, any questions you may have about this topic. You can do so on our CBC News Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/CBC News. You can also leave your questions in the comment sections there. You can also watch and connect with us via YouTube, and if you'd like to ask questions there, you can post your questions or comments in the chat section. Well, with that all said, as we said in the introduction, both Barbara and Sam, we have right now a situation in Charlottesville where there's another state of emergency. People are concerned that this is the 1-year anniversary of Charlottesville. Could we see another Charlottesville, the level of violence that we saw last year? Could we see that again this weekend? Barbara, what do you think?
I think there's every possibility that we could. I think the tensions and the emotions are running really high right now. They certainly didn't decrease over the last year. And I think after last year's Charlottesville, Trump did not help matters by not speaking out against the violence that occurred there. So I think that given that the environment, the political climate has not changed very much, and that in fact the movement itself has grown in the past year, I think there's every possibility that we could see the same sort of incident, the same sort of hostility there, and at the many other rallies that are planned for across Canada and the U.S.
Now, we have to say that Donald Trump did tweet earlier this morning in which he condemned racism of all kinds, which we'll bring up a little later. But before we get to that, Sam, I want to ask you, do you think that we might be looking at the same level of violence as we saw last year this time around?
Yes, most definitely, and I think that we need to consider what's happened in the political climate. Have we encouraged or really stamped down on this kind of discourse? And I think the answer is no, especially whether in Canada or the U.S., the encouraging of this type of sentiment and outward expression of these kind of really alt-right, hate-filled discourse has been on the rise. And this is something that, again, we see catches on, right? Whether it's viral or the media really latches on this type of expressions.
But why on the rise, do you think?
Because I think our political leaders, the political climate, encourages this type of speech. It becomes something that is rewarded. One gets a kind of notoriety to express it. And I think that's something that we haven't seen before.
Barbara, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we have created sort of a, I shouldn't say we, that there are those who have created sort of a climate of hate, a permission to hate, if you will, through their xenophobia, through the anti-Islam and anti-immigrant sentiment that we see so much of in the media and on social media especially. And I think that that's the real challenging piece, is that's where so many people get their news and get their sound bites. And that's where I think we see the most hateful sorts of commentary. So, and again, not just from the leaders, but from political leaders, but also from the leaders of the movement, the far-right movement, who are also very busy on social media and very busy in terms of recruitment and building coalitions as well, which I think is one of the more frightening trends.
We only have about a minute before I have to go to commercial break here, but I want to ask you, because you keep saying leaders. Is that leaders writ large, not only in the United States, but also here in Canada? Yeah,
we're certainly seeing it in Canada as well. We've seen it historically under the last Conservative administration at the federal level. We certainly saw more Islamophobic sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment than we'd seen before. We've seen it in Quebec under Marois and the Charter of Values. Kelly Leach in the last campaign for leadership.
The Canadian values test.
Yes, all of those pieces, and the hotline for barbaric cultural practices, all of those sorts of pieces. And I think we're starting to see it flare up even in Ontario now with, with the ongoing talk or the emerging talk about illegal as opposed to irregular migrants. So yeah, I think we're seeing flares of that here as well.
People calling it a crisis when others are saying we're not at the crisis level yet. Okay, so listen, we're going to put a pause in the conversation right now because we are going to take a quick commercial break, but we're going to continue this this discussion right here on CBC News Network. But as we also said, the conversation is also on Facebook and on YouTube. So we're going to continue the social media platforms of this conversation during the commercial break. We are asking you, though, is society more or less tolerant a year after the deadly protests in Charlottesville, Virginia? Head over to CBC News' Facebook page, facebook.com/CBC News. Leave your questions there or do so in the comment section of YouTube. To those on News Network, quick break. We'll be back. To those on social media, stay with us. The conversation continues. That may have brought about this or continued this type of hate in Canada. Tell us about your perspective. Again, we heard the examples that Barbara brought of political leadership here. What's the examples you would bring up? Yeah,
I think the examples I would think about is the kind of as Barbara was mentioning, the active campaigning around the fear-mongering, around the idea that in Canada there's only so much to go around, whether in this province or the country writ large, and that there's a particular type of status or access to resources that we need to be fearful about because the other, whether it's refugee, illegal immigrant, all that, is going to come and take this away from us, right? So we see that really at the base, and this move towards a base politics that's centered around fear is something that I think we do need to grapple with and really call out when we see, because that really does promote a kind of distaste or disdain and around people that are not, quote, as former Prime Minister might say, old stock Canadians. Right?
And talk about the refugee crisis as well. I'm using the terminology crisis because it's been used, but there are a lot of people that say we're not at the crisis. But to your point, Barbara, that creates an atmosphere that you believe, or was saying, creates anti-diversity sentiment.
Yeah, I think so. And it's coming from many quarters. And I think the latest one, even coming from the federal Liberals, with Blair now in charge of this this new department, and the title is to link in that title border issues and organized crime conflates immigrants with criminality, and I think that that's a huge political mistake, and I think it feeds into the sort of sentiments that you've been referring to. And so we have that, but we also have just the creation of that crisis and the creation of irregular migrants as illegal immigrants is also problematic.
I'm going to get you to pause there because we're to the social media platform. We're now about to rejoin CBC News Network. Stay with us. We're going to continue the conversation in just a few seconds' time right here.
They do so much and they protect so much and they put their life in their lines, and bang, they're gone in a minute, and there's two families that are very, very devastated.
One of the many people stopping to pay their respects at the memorial outside of the Fredericton police station last night. 4 people died in a shooting in the city early Friday. 2 of the victims were police officers, Lawrence Rob Costello and Sarah May Burns. Another victim is a local musician by the name of Donny Robichaud, and we now know the identity of the 4th victim, just identified as Bobby Lee Wright. As for the suspect, 48-year-old Matthew Vincent Raymond, he is in custody and has been charged. Well, we'll have more on that story throughout the day, but right now we want to go back to our panel discussion about what's fueling what's known generally as the alt-right. White nationalists are in fact planning a rally in Washington, D.C. tomorrow on the anniversary of the Charlottesville violence that we saw last year. Barbara Perry and Sam Tecle are here in studio. They have been talking to us about this subject matter. We've also been speaking during the commercial break on Facebook and YouTube. The discussion continues there as well. And again, please leave your comments and questions on those social media platforms. Sam, I want to pick up with you here. When we talk about the language that is being used, Barbara put up some examples on News Network before we went to commercial break of political leaders perhaps using language that disadvantages diversity. What are the practical effects that you see?
Yeah, so even with the term alt-right, right, we might mark that as a euphemism for white supremacy, right? So the idea that we would make these things gentler, right? The idea that we would say that these things are racially infused rather than say these are racist remarks. These are anti-diversity, these are xenophobic, these are racist, right? So I think that's important. And I think when we think about the kind of comments and the remarks that happen, they're usually really pushing back against what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 decades around a push towards diversity, around employment equity, multiculturalism policies, right? So this idea to return to a time where either Canada or the US was great is to say we need to pull back or repeal on all that's happened in this meantime that have made this place more diverse, right? That have given other groups of people a claim on Canada. So I think we need to mark that when we see it, and also use the more harsh and critical terms for what we're seeing.
Well, let me jump in there, because you're right. Alt-right is an umbrella descriptor. Barbara, break down for us the groups, the constituents of what is defined as the alt-right.
Well, if you want to use their definition, the alt-right does not define themselves as a racist or white supremacist group. But
they do have elements that have been attached to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, they would define themselves as, you know, good Americans, good Canadians, as you say, harking back to a better day. But if you look at the rhetoric and the sentiment that they express, it really is about othering and about distancing themselves from not just racialized communities, although those tend to be the key audiences or the key targets, but also LGBTQ communities, feminists, you know, anyone who you know, sort of challenges the status quo and who represents the ideals associated with multiculturalism. So it's really pushback, as you said, against multiculturalism, against diversity, against inclusion, which I think are true Canadian values. So that's always the irony when they talk about, you know, recreating Canadian values. Yeah.
Yeah, let me jump in there, only because I think there's also a distinction that needs to be made, because Jesus Gonzalez is on the YouTube page watching us, and he, in asking what the alt-right actually means, he wants to ask a question: is alt-right a conservative? But that's that's far too simplistic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I would say it is conservative, but it's much more than that as well. It's racist and racialist,
because there are conservatives who stand for diversity and stand for other values.
It's the antithesis of progressive. So it's not progressive conservative, as we've known the PCs in this country in the past, that red Tory. It's a much more traditionalist ideal in terms of the supremacy of a certain kind of conservative values, you know, again, associated with homogeneity of a culture, white, Christian, straight, male-dominated, patriarchal cultures.
Let me jump in, because we're going to quickly go back to commercial break. But Sam, I want to ask you this. This is someone who identifies himself as CoolFun11 on YouTube. Do you think the alt-right should be allowed to share their political views, or should it be considered hate speech?
I mean, most definitely it is hate speech. And I think what the false equivalency between, and we have limits on speech in this country, right, where hate speech is not something we condone and not something we should give a platform to. Yet I think what they've been able to do is carve out this idea that, you know, a PC, politically correct, which means anything goes, which is something that we haven't had in this country for a while. So to think that we should allow that is something we should push back against. Okay,
pause right now, because we are going to go to break on CBC News Network. Again, this conversation continues on Facebook and YouTube. Send us your questions. Stay with us. We're talking about the alt-right and what it actually means to not only the United States, but also here in Canada. You're watching CBC News Network. When we come back on this platform, we will update your top stories and your headlines. Stay with us. And so as we say goodbye to our network, CBC News Network audience, again, we are continuing this conversation on our social media platforms, Facebook and YouTube. Ask your questions, make your comments on the chat section. We'll bring it to the panel here. Barbara, Sam, thank you for staying with us. I'm going to bring in another question here. This one by F Society, and it brings up your point, Sam, because you're talking about how what they're saying is hate speech at the end of the day. So to that comment, F Society on YouTube is asking, are they then breaking the law? Barbara?
That's a difficult one. So I think we have to keep in mind that we have fairly limited legislation around hate speech. We had Section 13 of the Human Rights Code, which did protect communities against offensive and harmful speech. That's been repealed under the last Harper administration. So now really all we have to attack that are Sections 318 and 319 in the Criminal Code, and they're really about hate propaganda. So you have to prove that there is an incitement to hatred or an incitement to genocide. And law enforcement are very loath to pursue pursue those sorts of charges.
Because they're hard to prove.
They're very hard to prove, and Crowns are very loath to prosecute them as well. So we have very limited weapons with which to confront hate speech as we might understand it. And I think that that's a real challenge. I know that there are conversations afoot about reintroducing something like Section 13 so that we can protect. And in this environment, we need to have those conversations. So at this point, unless they're saying, and some of them do, in fact, on their websites, unless they're saying, you need to eliminate this threat, you need to take up arms against this threat, there's very little that law enforcement or the courts can do to pursue this sort of rhetoric. And they're very good about veiling their rhetoric as well, so that they know where those lines are. They know where those legal lines are, many of them, and are very careful to not step over that line towards incitement.
Well, that then brings me to the role of the federal government here, Sam, because as we all know, that in the last federal election, when the Canadian values and that hotline was raised, it caused a lot of controversy. Justin Trudeau took advantage of that. It helped propel his campaign, helped propel him to victory. He makes nice statements about a diverse Canada. But if we're talking about a lag in the laws, is the federal government doing enough to ensure the fact that diversity is protected and that hate speech does not propagate?
No, in my opinion, and we can always push further, because I think what Trudeau did in that last election was appeal to something larger than base politics, appeal to something other than hate, and that actually coincides with Canadian values, right? So I think that's something that we need the federal government to do in the next election, as they push back against the idea that this refugee crisis, in many ways we might say that it's not a crisis, that has pushed itself to the center of the federal political agenda. So how do we combat that, right? How might the federal government appeal to what Canadians like to tell ourselves that we're about? So I do think that we need to push towards something that's not so easy, right, on the base level, but something that we can imagine to an ethical stance, and it's hopefully something that will vibe with Canadians on a level that is that we recognize around multiculturalism, diversity, equity, social justice, the values that we say make up the fabric of this country. Well,
as you say, vibe with Canadians, we have a lot of questions to ask from our viewers, so I'm going to switch that. But as we continue this conversation, because we're back on the social media platforms, a quick introduction to the two of you. Barbara Perry, who's closest to me, is a global hate crime expert, also the author In the Name of Hate. Sam Tecle is a researcher on racial inequality. He's at York University in Toronto. Just the quick introductions there. So let's continue with the questions being asked on social media, because on Facebook, and this is an interesting one, I'm going to ask it of you, Barbara, but if you jump in as well, Sam, if you have a thought. This is from Norman Crandall, who asks, who is funding the movement?
That's a really good question. I mean, some of it, it's not a wealthy movement in the Canadian context, so I don't think we need to look for very deep pockets there in many respects. It's largely self-funded. Some of them have, sort of donation pages on their websites. So I think it's really self-funded. We do have, I think, things like it's gone, not Fox News. In the Canadian
Sun News.
Rebel
Media.
Media,
Okay, sorry.
Rebel Media, who is, I think, very much a part of this landscape, and is a little better funded than the Proud Boys might be, or Soldiers of Odin, for example, might be. But yeah, no doubt that they do have some donors in their communities, where they have their local chapters. But I don't think there's any great conspiracy of funding from the Russians or even the American. Right.
Yeah, and I would add also, it behooves us, I think, to think of a coordinated boogeyman, rather than this is a sentiment that's probably more spread out than we think, right? And these things get veiled under...
so a loud minority of people is what you're saying.
Exactly, and maybe majority. The idea that you can activate a sentiment where people are fearful for their loss of their job, like these are how these things get translated onto the ground, right? Whether that there's the barbarians at the gate kind of discourse, this idea of a refugee crisis. So and then they get funded in these small donations along the way, rather than something that's being coordinated by a boogeyman in the shadows. I think we need to confront that reality, and that when these dog whistle politics are used, it activates the everyday person, rather than the person who's going to the meetings, who's going to these websites, who's producing the pamphlets that we're discussing today. So I think we can mount a better stance, if we think about it in that fashion, because these are to be quite honest, everyday people that are participating in these kinds of politics.
Well, let me pick up there then, because Shay Lewis on Facebook has phrased it this way, quote, given how ignoring the alt-right did not work and current civil discourse and debate is not working, what tools can we use to fight alt-right/fascist ideology? Barbara?
Yeah, and you know, I'd be rich by now, I think, if I had the answer to that question. It's not an easy issue. It's not an easy response. There are, I think, multiple levels on which we need to challenge the movement. I think, you know, we've been talking about the rally plan for Charlottesville. Let's not forget that there are also rallies planned in Canada. The key leaders have pulled out of the Toronto rally, but my understanding is that some of the other groups are still going to be there. You know, I think that continuing to represent ourselves, represent those Canadian values that we hold dear at those rallies, so that the anti-racist continue to outnumber the racist minority. I think that our political leaders need to take a firmer stand and be much more vocal in challenging the far right and the rhetoric associated with it. I think we need to educate not just our students and our youth. That's certainly a starting point, but we need to sort of educate the broader culture. I think there's not a great deal of awareness about you know, sort of the depth and the impact of these far right groups in the Canadian context, and I think that we need to share that a little bit more. We need the legislative tools to also counter. You know, we had no hesitation in asking for enhanced tools to deal with Islamist-inspired extremism, yet we're not asking for those same tools in dealing with far right extremism. And I think that, you know, that this last year and a half or so has really highlighted the extent to which we do need more protective legislation around hate speech.
Okay, I'm going to take what you said. I'm going to add it to a comment. This is from, excuse me, my of course computer just jumped going through social media here, so excuse me here. But this is being asked by Stephen Schneider on Facebook, and I think we touched upon it somewhat. What is Canada going to do to stop neoliberal imperialism at home and abroad? That's how he is phrasing that. We've talked about what the government isn't doing. Concretely, if you were to advise the government, Sam, what would you say the priorities would be in terms of addressing this issue in this country?
Yeah, and I think what we need to actually acknowledge, or at least at the federal level, which has not been acknowledged to date, is the idea that this country was founded on the enslavement of black people and the dispossession of Native and Aboriginal populations here. So if we begin with that, and the idea to think about the progress or the movement that's been made towards something else, so that would mean that this Canadian space, multiple groups can lay claim to it, so that there are multiple voices at the table that we need to discuss, and that multiculturalism and diversity, rather than passive values, are active values. We need to actively practice this, and it needs to be something that we can use against this kind of speech where it makes this Canadian space only for a select few, right? So I think if we can mount that kind of stance, is something at least from which to work on, because right now we can see that inside these discourses and these speech acts, there's something that says that Canada's has ever only been for this small group of white Christian male predominantly population, and that's never been the case. This country has been, it's been a coalition of groups that have made this Canadian space what it is. And the idea, I think what we need to be hesitant about is the idea that we are inherently multicultural and diversity, which can actually provide the cover for these types of things to continue, rather than us calling them out actively because we think it might be impolite in Canadian society. We need to act like confront these things head on, I think, is something, because if not, we can see what might fester. And
you think that's we're being too polite?
I think so, because these are impolite statements. These are people's lives that they're disregarding or saying that don't belong in this place. Yet we can, that's not even a historically valid argument. History tells us that this place has been made by multiple groups, and multiple groups who have been violated and sacrificed. So if we have that kind of conversation, we can then move to a better place that says a more accurate place, because I think if we allow what's been happening to continue and giving these types of arguments a platform, that those kinds of discussions fall off the table, which I think then we need to be really hesitant.
Okay, well, I only have space for about 2 more questions, so let's bear with me, but I do want to continue this. JF Durelow is asking this question on YouTube, and Barbara, I'll ask it of you. What about the alt-left? Is there such a thing as an alt-left?
Well, I think the alt-left now is what we think of as the Antifa, excuse me, that we've seen at so many of the rallies. And It's a difficult.
Define that for people who have not had.
Anti-fascist groups. So they're anti-racist, anti-fascist. So they identify the alt-right and the far-right as fascist, and they're challenging that. And they tend to sort of be the most visible elements of the counter demonstrations at the protests associated with the far right. The challenge is there. For me, extremism is extremism, and it's dangerous in any context. And so, as we saw in Montreal just around Christmas time in November, December, I think it was last fall, the violence at that rally was largely from the Antifa, and that does the anti-racist movement no favors, I think. You know, to be vocal, right? Shout them out, outnumber them, but to engage in what was really random violence, because it wasn't even directed towards the fascists. It was directed towards police and towards city property. That's damaging as well. So I think that you know, the Antifa movement as a whole has something to offer the challenge to the far right, but you know, that's sort of the extreme polar opposite from the politeness that that characterizes so many of the rest of us. So I think that's it's a challenging movement to think about. So
the anti-fascist movement discredits progressives the way the alt-right movement disadvantages people identify as conservative. Let me pick it up. One last question here. I'm going to actually go with Sharon Taylor, and only because it builds on what you were saying, Sam. Why do we not educate children in school, help them to avoid these hate groups? Would that be something that would be worthwhile?
Most definitely, and I think the idea that the idea of political education in schools is, I think, sorely lacking. And I mean, I've taught in schools in Toronto, and I know that much of these types of discussions are seen as not the place in schools. So I would wonder and want to understand how might we have a more critical education around the idea, like I said, that the multiculturalism and diversity that we want to tout is something that we need to work for and towards, and perhaps this is a moving target. So I would think that that's definitely a wide open space in schools to have these very difficult conversations, because then we can see that the lack of political education, or the ability to have these discussions, and even the desire to translate into, you know, adults that don't want to have these conversations, that in many ways have never been given the tools to. So that's something that I try to incorporate in my teaching, and I know Barbara does too. But it's an uphill battle, I think, for sure.
Pick up on that point, Barbara. Your thoughts on educating kids so that hate groups don't flourish? Yeah,
absolutely. A couple of years ago, in one of my courses at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, we had students developing both online and offline interventions against right-wing extremism, and part of that was building a workshop that they delivered to some of the high schools. And what they found most interesting was when they went in, it wasn't, you know, the students had no idea what the far right was, had no idea what right-wing extremism was, but nor did their teachers. So their teachers weren't even in a position to have those conversations. So this is something I'm continuing to build on, is you know, this sort of education in the schools, this awareness. You know, we do talk in the schools about, you know, signs, looking for signs of Islamist-inspired extremism, but we don't look for signs of right-wing extremism. And I think that that's something that we need to begin making real interventions against.
Okay, well, I do appreciate the time and the insight and the conversation. Unfortunately, I'm going to say we will probably speak again on this topic, but thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you.
And that was Barbara Perry, global hate crime expert, author In the Name of Hate, Sam Tecle, researcher on racial inequality from York University in Toronto. And thank you to all our viewers who watched on Facebook and YouTube. You can replay the whole conversation on both social media platforms if you missed any part of it. And do join us throughout the day right here on CBC News Network. Again, thanks to the two of you. And thank you for joining us today. We'll be right back.